unto the Lord our God, for he is mercy and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and abounding in steadfast love. The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 15th chapter, beginning with the first verse.
Glory to you, O Lord.
You may be seated. We're going to do things just a little bit different today because for our Gospel today, we have the entire 15th chapter of Mark, which is a long chapter, and we go through a lot of different things, and there's a lot of interesting little side points in this gospel that I want to talk about. And so for today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the gospel, and I'm going to stop periodically to talk to you about it, to tell you what's going on in this case, maybe add a little background information. The idea being this is a story that tells us something very important about what God has done for us. And so I want to take the time to really look at each part of this story. And so if I read the whole gospel and then did a sermon, we'd only be able to focus on a little part. So instead of one long sermon today, you're getting like 6 short ones, okay? So, it begins with the first verse of chapter 15. Jesus has been arrested. He has already been betrayed, and he has been arrested and brought before Pilate. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. So this is how the gospel begins. This is how Jesus' trial and eventually death begins. And I think this is a point that we really need to pay attention to because it kind of informs how we hear the rest of this story. Pilate asks Jesus some questions. Pilate brings these charges against him and asks him, it says that you're the king of the Jews. And the only thing Jesus says is, "If you say so." It's the only thing. Pilate continues with all these different accusations, and Jesus stays quiet. Here's what we know. Jesus is an innocent man. Jesus easily could have defended himself. Jesus easily could have said, "No, that's not right. Oh, they're just taking that out of context. Let me tell you what I was actually saying." Jesus could have, we know Jesus is an excellent public speaker. He has proven that time and time again in his ministry. Here is a time where his life is on the very line, and Jesus chooses to be silent. And I think what we can take from that is that because Jesus chooses to be silent, he chooses this path because he knows that it is something that needs to happen. He knows that he has a greater journey. This is the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus' death on the cross is seen not so much as shame, but as triumph. This is Jesus taking that first step towards the triumph over death that is coming. So it continues. Now, at the festival, Pilate used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Pilate is one of those really interesting characters in the Bible. Pilate is a Roman government official. He is a governor of this area. It's occupied country, right? He is in charge of a people who were conquered and are now under the rule of a foreign power. It is not an easy job, I would imagine. And there's even a note here that kind of talks about that. Barabbas is a renowned murderer who is in prison. But he committed murder during an insurrection, during a rising up against the Roman people. So Pilate knows how quickly and how easily things can get out of control. And because of that, that seems to be all Pilate is really worried about, is keeping things from turning into a riot. And he's having this war inside himself. He's got his duty, which is to keep the peace. But he also knows that Jesus is an innocent man. He knows that these charges are false, are worked up. And so he's trying to find a way to have a compromise for everything. He knows that, okay, we often release someone, so maybe I can get them to do that. They'll have their fun. They've arrested him. They've ridiculed him. We can release him. Everything will go. But that is not how the story goes. That is not where Jesus needs to be. And the crowds yell out, "Crucify him." And Pilate has to make a choice between his job and his conscience. And he chooses his job. And though often we sit, thousands of years later and we look back on Pilate and we go, "Oh, Pilate, he was the bad guy," all that kind of stuff. He didn't make the right choice. I think if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of us would struggle with that choice. Between the job that you know, between the duty that you've been given, and your conscience telling you maybe this isn't the right thing. It is a choice that we as human beings are faced with over and over and over again. And sometimes we make the right choice. Sometimes we mess up. But always, Christ is still going to the cross for us. It doesn't matter that Pilate doesn't step up in this moment. It doesn't matter that Pilate washes his hands of the whole thing. Jesus still goes to the cross. Not just for the disciples, but for Pilate as well. Not just for those of us who make the right decision, but for those who make the wrong one as well. So then we'll continue. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And then they clothed him in purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. I remember when I was younger and we would read the Passion story, and whenever we would get to this part, I was always kind of confused. I couldn't understand why the soldiers, who probably don't know who Jesus is that much, they are not Jewish leaders, they are Roman soldiers. They are there on assignment. Jesus to them might not be any different than any other person that has come through their hands. And yet, they take such apparent glee in humiliating him, in hurting him. And I remember as a kid, I could not understand that. Why do they do that? And as I got older and I started reading history books and learning about how human beings react in times of war and in times of having to do things that are hard, I realized there is a pattern that is here. One of the things that governments will tell you with armies is one of the first things they try to do with a soldier is try to dehumanize the enemy. Because one of the only ways that we as human beings can do horrible things is when we in our mind first dehumanize the other. We make them less than human. Because as soon as we start seeing them as another beloved child of Christ, as another beautiful human, it becomes really hard to say horrible things, to do horrible things. We see God in them and we pause. And so in order to carry out war, in order to carry out executions, in order to carry out torture, human beings need to set aside their humanness and dehumanize the other. And that's what they're doing to Jesus here. The soldiers who don't know Jesus, but they do have to follow through on his death sentence, they begin to dehumanize him. They mock him. They try to make him something lesser. Now, in our lives, there are lots of times where we do that. not to the extent that we are executing anybody or anything like that, but we do that dehumanization of our neighbors because it makes it easier to dismiss their needs. It makes it easier to pretend like their desires, their needs, their wants aren't important because they're not fully human. We can see them as the other. And many a politician, many people throughout history have seen the power of this. It's real easy to divide people, to control people when you give them an enemy. When you say all of your problems are because of these people, because these people are wrong and bad and different. And so in our minds we can go, okay, they're not like us. I can treat them how I want. Christ calls for something greater. Because here's the truth. Even though they are beating him, even though they are mocking him, even though they are trying to dehumanize him, Jesus is still going to the cross. And he is going to the cross for them. And he's going to the cross for all of us. And our response to that kind of love, our response to that kind of amazing, incredible love, is to not forget that that love is for all. And live our lives in the truth that our neighbors are too beloved children of Christ. So then they compelled the passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourselves and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. This section of Mark actually stands out a little bit in Mark. Mark is known for his very abruptness. Some of you have heard this, but I had a professor describe Mark as kind of the dragnet style of writing. Just the facts, ma'am. I mean, it's boom, boom, boom. He goes to this one, he goes to this one, he goes to this one. Mark doesn't have a lot of details. And yet, in these couple verses here, Mark adds quite a bit of detail. He adds detail about the time. He adds detail about what the soldiers say to him. He adds detail about the soldiers dividing his clothes and playing dice, basically, for them, gambling for them. He adds all of these very specific details, which is so different from how Mark usually writes that I think it means we should pay attention. And I think the reason Mark is adding all of these details because these details are important. These details tie back to Mark's entire view of Jesus' death on the cross, is that it is a triumph. It is a fulfilling of destiny. And so Mark calls back to all of these prophetic messages about the Messiah. And there are messages about Christ being crucified, or not Christ, but the Messiah being crucified early in the morning, and about the Messiah being put to death on a tree. It's about the Messiah's clothes being torn apart, or not torn apart, but being divided among them, and they cast lots for them. All of these little details written thousands of years ago about the Messiah, and Jesus is fulfilling them all. Because if he's fulfilling these small prophecies, he fulfills the big one, which is Christ is here to save the lost sheep. Christ is here to be the lamb that sacrifices himself for us all. And now when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come down and take him." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Jesus, and Salome. These used to follow him and provide for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. There are two parts here that I want to pull apart and talk to you a little bit. The first is the last little bit there that I read. Mark goes out of his way to name the women who were there. This is pretty important. This comes at a time, both when Mark wrote his gospel, but when Jesus was walking the earth, when women were not seen as equals in society. And they could not give testimony in court. A woman needed to have a man agree with her for her testimony to count in court. And so the fact that Mark makes a point of naming these women who were some of the very first witnesses to Christ, who were the very first followers and leaders in the church. The beauty of Mark naming them is it ties into the greater theme of what Jesus is doing, which is opening up doorways, which is bringing the kingdom of heaven to all, which is taking down those walls and those borders that separate us from the love of God, and showing that all of us, no matter who we are, no matter our standing in society, are followers of Christ, are beloved children of God. It is a really important, interesting verse that I don't think we talk about as much. Mark taking the time to naming the women who followed Jesus and who were there through the entire thing. The other part which ties into this, the reason I started with the women thing, because when Jesus passes away, when Jesus breathes his last, the temple, it says the curtain in the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. Now, some of you might not understand what that is in reference to. Well, there is the temple where the entire faith of the Jews at the time took place. It was in Jerusalem, and everyone went there. That is where your faith took place. You went to the temple, and it was believed that is where God himself resided. And in the temple, they had a courtyard, and then you went inside, and there was an outer area inside where people were allowed to be, and where you mingled around and you did your sacrifices and you heard readings and all that kind of stuff. But then there was this large curtain, some accounts 30, 40 yards high, this huge curtain hanging down. And behind the curtain was a place that only the most purest of rabbis were allowed to go. It was thought that this is where God lived, where God dwelled. And so it was a place, this curtain was set up to keep the unclean from getting too close to God. This curtain was set up to separate the people from God. And then Jesus dies. And there is nothing more separating us from God. And the temple curtain is torn in two, opening up God's presence to the entire world. It is a huge, huge thing. When Christ died on that cross, he died for all mankind, and no longer was there anything separating us from God's presence in our lives. Christ may have died on the cross, but God flowed into the world in ways that the world had never known. And we experience that now. I mean, there's a reason when we talk about the curtain, we sometimes have to explain it, because we don't experience God in that way. We don't experience God as God is only in this one place and we can't go there. We have to have special people who go there for us. No, we know God. We experience God in our hearts every day. Now for the final part of the reading. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in the tomb that had been hewn out of rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, saw where the body was laid. So this is the end of chapter 15. Jesus has died on the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea, who is not one of Jesus' known followers before this time, he is not of Jewish heritage. He is a member of the Roman Council. But Jesus' message has reached him. Jesus' message has taught him. And though he is not a full-fledged disciple of Christ yet, he still wants to do something in the name of Christ. I think this final part is kind of the final cap on the message of Christ bringing God to the world. Because here we have a man who's starting to get there, who's starting to maybe understand who Jesus is and want to follow him, but isn't fully there yet. And I would imagine there are some of us who feel like that, right? There are some of us who some days we feel like our faith, yeah, this sounds like a good idea, but we're not really sure. And God has a place for you. God has a job for you. Joseph of Arimathea comes to Pilate. He takes the body. He puts him in the tomb. He has the stone rolled in front. And standing there again, keeping watch as they have been since the beginning, are Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And they are there, and they are waiting. And that's how we enter Holy Week. We are here, and we are waiting. Waiting for what comes next. Waiting for Good Friday when we mourn the sin in this world that led Christ to his death. But we are waiting patiently and so maybe with a little hope for that Sunday morning when Christ will rise again and take us with him to this kingdom of heaven that we are living in, this joy of God's presence in our lives. And I know we have a lot of guests here today, and maybe some of you aren't always coming to church. Well, I know we have some members here who don't always come to church. That's okay. That's part of it. There are plenty of us whose lives don't lead us to lives of faith that often, to moments where we are following God fully, where we are falling on our knees and praying. Sometimes we just show up. Here's the good news. There are lots of people in Jesus' life who don't know yet, but show up. Mary don't know that Jesus is going to rise again, but they show up. That message is for all of us. That promise that God has made, that triumph that is coming over death is for all of us. Christ sees each one of us as fully children of a loving God. And each one of you, as you sit here today, as you go out into this world, as you enter into Holy Week, know this. You are each a beloved child of God, and Christ has died for you. Amen. Our hymn of the day is What Wondrous Love Is This, number 666, or as projected.